The morning alarm buzzed through the metal corridors of the Unity's Pride, humanity's largest diplomatic vessel. Taman rolled out of his narrow bunk in the junior staff quarters and checked his watch. Another day of being ignored by the senior diplomats awaited him. He dressed quickly in his standard-issue diplomatic uniform and made his way to the main briefing room. The corridors were wide and clean, but Taman knew every scratch and dent from his 6 months aboard the ship. Unlike the senior staff who had private quarters, he shared his small room with 3 other junior aides. The briefing room was already full when he arrived. Ambassador Hyunwoo stood at the front, his expensive tailored uniform making him look more like a corporate executive than a diplomat. Around him sat the senior staff, all from wealthy families who had bought their children positions in the diplomatic corps. They barely glanced at Taman as he found a seat in the back. "Today marks a historic moment," Hyunwoo announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never faced real hardship. "We have made contact with the Draconic Hegemony, one of the most powerful empires in this sector of space." Taman listened carefully. He had studied the hegemony during his training. They were a reptilian species that had conquered dozens of worlds through superior technology and ruthless tactics. Most species either submitted to them or were destroyed. "The hegemony has agreed to meet with us," Hyunwoo continued. "However, they have certain customs we must follow. They require any species seeking diplomatic relations to undergo something called the Trial of Worth." Minji, Hyunwoo's ambitious deputy, leaned forward in her chair. She had made it clear from day one that she saw Taman as beneath her notice. "What exactly does this trial involve, sir?" "According to their transmission, it tests the worthiness of a species through their chosen representative. The representative must face 3 challenges that test their mind, body, and spirit. Success opens the door to negotiations. Failure..." Hyunwoo paused dramatically. "Failure means the species is marked as unworthy and banned from hegemony space. Forever." A murmur went through the room. Taman felt his stomach tighten. This was serious business. The hegemony controlled key trade routes and resources that humanity desperately needed. "Who will represent humanity?" asked Jinho, another senior diplomat whose family owned half the shipping companies in the outer colonies. Hyunwoo smiled, but there was something cold in his eyes. "That requires careful consideration. The representative will face unknown dangers. We need someone expendable." Taman's blood ran cold. He had heard that word too many times in his short career. Expendable. It was what they called people like him, people who had earned their positions through hard work instead of family connections. After the briefing, Taman returned to his duties. He spent the morning updating trade reports and organizing diplomatic files, work that the senior staff considered beneath them. During lunch, he sat alone in the junior mess hall, eating the basic rations while the senior staff enjoyed fresh meals in their private dining room. It was during the afternoon shift that Minji approached his workstation. She wore her usual expression of barely concealed disgust when looking at him. "Taman," she said, managing to make his name sound like an insult. "Ambassador Hyunwoo wants to see you in his office." Taman saved his work and followed her through the ship's corridors. Hyunwoo's office was 3 times the size of Taman's shared quarters, with real windows showing the stars and a desk made from actual earth wood. "Sit down," Hyunwoo said without looking up from his tablet. Taman took the uncomfortable metal chair across from the ambassador's desk. "I've been reviewing your file," Hyunwoo continued. "You come from a working family on the mining colonies. No formal diplomatic training before the academy. No family connections in government or business. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Taman replied, keeping his voice steady. He knew where this was going. "And yet you scored highest on the xenology exams. You speak 4 alien languages fluently. Your tactical analysis reports are surprisingly thorough." Hyunwoo finally looked up. "Tell me, what do you think of the Draconic Hegemony?" Taman had prepared for this question. "They're a hierarchical society that values strength and direct confrontation. Their expansion has been successful because they adapt their tactics to each species they encounter. They respect competence but have little patience for weakness or deception." Interesting analysis. Hyunwoo leaned back in his chair. I've decided that you will represent humanity in the trial of worth. The words hit Taemin like a physical blow. He had expected this, but hearing it still shocked him. Sir, with respect, wouldn't someone more senior be better suited for such an important mission? Minji, who had been standing silently by the door, spoke up. The ambassador has made his decision. This is a great opportunity for you to prove yourself. Taemin looked between them and understood. This was not an opportunity. This was a sacrifice. They expected him to fail, and when he did, they would use his failure as justification for their own careers. They might even use it to negotiate from a position of cleaning up his mess, painting themselves as the real diplomats who could fix what the expendable junior aide had broken. I understand, Taemin said quietly. When do I leave? Tomorrow morning, Hyunwoo replied. You'll take a shuttle to the hegemony vessel. The trial begins immediately upon your arrival. I trust you'll do your best to represent humanity with dignity, even if you can't achieve success. That evening, Taemin sat in his quarters while his roommates were at dinner. He pulled up everything he could find about the draconic hegemony on his personal tablet. Most of the information was basic, but he found fragments of reports from species that had survived contact with them. The dragons respected strength, but they defined strength differently than humans might expect. Physical power was important, but so was mental resilience and strategic thinking. They had little patience for begging or emotional displays, but they could be impressed by clever solutions to impossible problems. Most importantly, Taemin found a reference to the fact that no species had ever succeeded in the trial of worth on their first attempt. The dragons seemed to expect initial failure as a learning experience. The question was whether humanity would get a second chance if he failed. As he prepared for sleep, Taemin made a decision. He would not go into this trial expecting to fail. His superiors might see him as expendable, but he refused to see himself that way. He had gotten this far through determination and hard work. Tomorrow he would face whatever the dragons threw at him with everything he had. The next morning came too quickly. Taemin packed his few possessions and reported to the shuttle bay. Hyunwoo and the senior staff were there to see him off, but their presence felt more like attendance at a funeral than a send-off for an important mission. Remember, Hyunwoo said as Taemin boarded the shuttle, you represent all of humanity. Try not to embarrass us too badly. As the shuttle pulled away from the Unity's Pride, Taemin watched the ship shrink in the viewport. Soon he could see the massive hegemony vessel waiting for him, dark and angular like a predator in space. Whatever happened next, he was on his own. The shuttle pilot, a grizzled veteran named Dong-yun, glanced back at him. First time meeting dragons, kid? Yes, Taemin admitted. Piece of advice, Dong-yun said. They respect honesty more than bravery. Don't try to be something you're not. Just be the best version of yourself. Taemin nodded, grateful for the first encouraging words he had heard in days. As they approached the dragon ship, he took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever came next. The docking bay of the hegemony ship was unlike anything Taemin had ever seen. The walls were black metal carved with intricate patterns that seemed to move in the dim lighting. The air was warm and heavy, carrying a scent like heated stone and something metallic he could not identify. Two massive figures waited for him as he stepped off the shuttle. The dragons were even larger than the reports had suggested. They stood nearly 3 meters tall, their bodies covered in dark scales that reflected the artificial lights. Their eyes glowed with an inner fire that made Taemin feel like prey being studied by predators. I am Commander Thane, the larger dragon said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from his chest. You are the human representative? Yes, Taemin replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. I am Taemin of humanity. The second dragon made a sound that might have been laughter. So small, she said, her voice carrying amusement and contempt. I am Captain Vera. We expected someone more impressive from a species that claims to be worthy of our attention. Taemin had prepared for this. The dragons valued directness and disliked weakness. I understand your disappointment, he said calmly. Perhaps the trial will provide a better measure than appearances. Commander Thane's eyes narrowed slightly. Most species either cowered or blustered when faced with dragon disapproval. This human's calm response was unexpected. They led him through corridors that felt more like tunnels carved from living rock. The ship's interior was designed to intimidate, with sharp angles and shadows that seemed to hide watching eyes. Other dragons they passed stopped to stare at the small human walking between the two commanders. The den itself took Taemon's breath away. It was a massive chamber with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. The walls were covered with holographic displays showing different worlds, each one marked with symbols that Taemon recognized as conquest markers. This was a monument to the hegemony's victories. In the center of the chamber sat a dragon so ancient that his scales had turned almost black. His size dwarfed even the commanders who had escorted Taemon. When he spoke, every other dragon in the room fell silent. "I am Supreme Arbiter Goran," the ancient dragon said. "I have overseen the trials of 43 species. 37 failed completely. 6 achieved partial success and were granted limited trading rights. None have achieved full partnership." Taemon looked around the chamber and noticed other beings standing in smaller alcoves around the edges. These must be representatives of species that had recently been conquered, brought here to witness the trial as a reminder of the consequences of failure. "The trial of worth consists of 3 phases," Goran continued. "The combat of wills tests your mental strength against our psychological warfare techniques. The test of strength challenges your physical capabilities and endurance. The final judgment evaluates your strategic thinking under extreme pressure." "What happens if I fail?" Taemon asked. "Your species will be marked as unworthy," Goran replied without emotion. "You will be banned from hegemony space permanently. Your people will have no access to our trade routes or resources. For a young species like humanity, this would mean isolation and eventual stagnation." Several dragons around the chamber made sounds of approval. They clearly expected to add another conquest marker to their walls soon. "However," Goran continued, "if you succeed, humanity will be offered a chance at true partnership. Not submission, but cooperation between equals. This has never been achieved." Taemon nodded. The stakes were exactly as he had understood them. "I'm ready to begin." Goran's massive head tilted slightly. "You ask no questions about the specific challenges? You make no demands for preparation time? Most representatives spend hours trying to negotiate better terms." "Would such negotiations change the nature of the trial?" Taemon asked. "No. Then asking would waste both our time." Taemon said simply, "I came here to face the trial, not to delay it." A murmur went through the assembled dragons. This was not the behavior they expected from representatives of species they considered inferior. "Very well," Goran said. "The combat of wills begins now." The chamber darkened, and suddenly Taemon found himself surrounded by holographic images. They showed Earth burning, human cities in ruins, his people fleeing in terror as dragon fleets descended from the sky. The images were incredibly realistic, complete with sounds of screaming and the smell of smoke. "Behold the future of your species if you fail," a voice whispered in his ear. "See how your weakness dooms them all." But instead of breaking down or crying out in horror, Taemon began to study the images carefully. He walked closer to examine the details of the dragon attack formations, noting their tactics and weapon placements. "Interesting approach," he said out loud, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Your fleets are using a standard orbital bombardment pattern, but you're leaving gaps in your coverage near the polar regions. A smart defense force could exploit those blind spots." The images flickered, and the whispered voice returned with more urgency. "You cannot defeat us. Your people will die." "Perhaps," Taemon agreed, still examining the tactical displays. "But your current strategy assumes we would fight conventionally. Humans have a history of asymmetric warfare. We might not try to match your fleets directly. Instead, we would probably target your supply lines and communication networks." He pointed to specific elements in the holographic battle. "Your command ship is positioned here, well protected but relatively stationary. A small strike force with knowledge of your ship layouts could cause significant disruption from within." The images suddenly shifted, showing Taman himself being tortured by dragon interrogators. The pain felt completely real, sending waves of agony through his body. "Break," the voice demanded. "Beg for mercy and end this suffering." Taman gritted his teeth against the pain but continued analyzing what he saw. "Your interrogation techniques rely heavily on physical discomfort," he gasped out. "But humans have endured worse. Our history includes centuries of warfare, natural disasters, and survival in hostile environments." The torture intensified, but Taman refused to break. Instead, he began asking questions. "How long can you maintain this level of psychic projection? It must require significant energy. Are there cooldown periods between sessions?" Around the chamber, dragons were beginning to look at each other with confusion and growing interest. Their psychological warfare techniques had broken every previous representative within minutes. This human was not only enduring the assault, but treating it as a learning experience. The images faded and the normal lighting returned. Taman swayed on his feet, sweat pouring down his face, but he remained standing. "Supreme Arbiter." Goran leaned forward on his massive throne. "You did not beg. You did not break. You studied our methods even while experiencing their effects. This is unusual. Pain is temporary," Taman said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Knowledge lasts. If I'm going to represent my people, I need to understand what we might face." "And what is your assessment?" Goran asked. Taman straightened, meeting the ancient, dragon's burning gaze. "Your psychological warfare is effective against species that fight purely from emotion. But humans have learned to think strategically even under stress. We adapt quickly and turn disadvantages into advantages." For the first time since the trial began, Taman saw something like respect flicker in Goran's ancient eyes. "The second phase begins at dawn," the Supreme Arbiter announced. "Rest well, human. Tomorrow we'll test different strengths." As guards escorted him to a small chamber for the night, Taman noticed the other conquered representatives watching him with something he had not expected to see in their eyes: hope. Taman woke before dawn in the small chamber the dragons had provided. The bed was a simple metal slab with thin padding, clearly designed for function rather than comfort. He had slept better than expected, probably due to exhaustion from the previous day's mental ordeal. A dragon guard arrived with a bowl of gray nutritional paste and a cup of water. "Eat," the guard commanded. "You will need strength for today's challenges." The paste tasted like chalk mixed with metal shavings, but Taman ate every bit. He had learned long ago not to waste food, a lesson from his childhood on the mining colonies where meals were often uncertain. Commander Thane arrived to escort him back to the den. "You surprised many of us yesterday," the dragon said as they walked through the corridors. "Most representatives spend the night weeping or praying to their gods." "Did you expect me to?" Taman asked. "Honestly, yes," Thane replied. "Your species is young and untested. We assumed you would break quickly, under pressure." When they reached the den, Taman saw that the other conquered representatives were also present. They stood in a group near one wall, guarded by dragon soldiers. He counted 7 of them, each from a different species. Some were humanoid, others completely alien in appearance. Supreme Arbiter Goran addressed the assembled crowd. "The test of strength begins now. The human will face 5 challenges designed to test physical capability, endurance, and determination. Failure in any challenge ends the trial." The first challenge was called the climbing wall. A section of the den's wall transformed into a towering cliff face with handholds scattered across its surface. The wall stretched up into the darkness above and sharp metal spikes jutted out at irregular intervals. "Reach the top," Goran commanded. "You have 1 hour." Taman approached the wall and studied the pattern of handholds. His hands were soft, from years of diplomatic work, unlike the calloused fingers he had developed during his youth working construction on the mining platforms. Still, muscle memory remained. He began climbing steadily, not rushing but maintaining a consistent pace. The dragons had expected either reckless speed or hesitant caution. Instead, Taman climbed like someone who understood that endurance mattered, more than flash. Halfway up the wall, he encountered another climber. One of the conquered representatives, a thin humanoid with blue-tinged skin, hung from a handhold with obvious exhaustion. The creature's breathing was labored, and his grip was failing. Taman could have climbed past easily. Instead, he positioned himself below the struggling alien and braced his body to provide a foothold. "Step on my shoulder," he called up to the blue-skinned being. "Rest for a moment." The alien looked down in confusion. "Why would you help me? We are competitors. We're all prisoners here," Taman replied. "Competition doesn't require cruelty." The alien took the offered rest, and together they continued up the wall. When they reached the top, both had completed the challenge within the time limit. In the den below, dragons murmured among themselves. This behavior was unprecedented in their trials. The second challenge was the Gauntlet of Pain. Taman had to cross a long corridor while energy weapons fired painful but non-lethal bolts at him from hidden positions. The trick was to keep moving forward despite the constant agony. As Taman entered the corridor, the first bolt struck him in the shoulder. The pain was intense, like being stabbed with a hot knife. He stumbled but kept walking. More bolts struck him as he advanced, each one bringing fresh waves of agony. But instead of just enduring the pain, Taman began to analyze the patterns. The weapons fired in sequences, with brief gaps between volleys. By the time he was halfway through the corridor, he had identified the timing and was able to minimize the number of hits he took. "Remarkable," he heard Commander Thane comment to another dragon. "He's learning their attack patterns while under fire." The third challenge tested stamina. Taman had to carry heavy stones across an obstacle course while wearing restrictive armor. The weight was crushing, and the armor made every movement difficult. Sweat poured down his face as he struggled with the burden. Several of the conquered representatives had been forced to attempt this challenge as well. Taman noticed that one of them, a small reptilian creature, was clearly failing. The being could barely lift the stones, let alone carry them across the course. Without hesitation, Taman redistributed some of his own stones to lighten the reptilian's load. Then he helped guide the struggling creature through the most difficult obstacles. "You make this harder for yourself," the reptilian gasped out. "Maybe," Taman replied, breathing heavily. "But it makes it possible for you." When both of them completed the challenge, the dragons in the observation areas were no longer just murmuring. They were having animated discussions in their own language. The fourth challenge was a test of pain tolerance. Taman had to place his hands on metal plates that grew increasingly hot while maintaining perfect stillness. Most species could only endure the heat for a few minutes before reflexively pulling away. Taman's hands had been burned before during his work in the mining colonies. He knew how to manage pain through controlled breathing and mental focus. While the heat built to unbearable levels, he closed his eyes and retreated into techniques he had learned from necessity. When the challenge ended, his hands were red and blistered, but he had not moved them from the plates. The final physical challenge was combat against a dragon warrior. Taman faced an opponent twice his size with natural weapons and armor that made victory impossible through conventional means. But Taman did not try to win through strength. Instead, he focused on defense and observation. He dodged and weaved, studying his opponent's fighting style. When the dragon grew frustrated and began making mistakes, Taman used speed and timing to land precise strikes at vulnerable points. He could not defeat the dragon, but he lasted much longer than expected, and even managed to score several hits that impressed the watching crowd. "Enough," Supreme Arbiter Goran called out after 20 minutes of combat. "The human has demonstrated sufficient capability." As Taman caught his breath, the ancient dragon continued. "You have passed the test of strength, but not in the way we expected. You helped your competitors. You analyzed our methods while enduring them. You fought intelligently rather than desperately." "Is that a problem?" Taman asked. "It is unprecedented," Goran replied. "Every previous representative focused only on their own survival. You seem to consider the welfare of others even under extreme stress." That evening, as Taman rested in his chamber, several of the conquered representatives approached him. The blue-skinned climber introduced himself as Kale from the planet Ossing. The small reptilian was named Zix from the desert world of Thyron. "Why did you help us?" Kyle asked. "We are not your people." Taman considered the question carefully. "Where I come from, we learned that survival often depends on cooperation. The strongest individual cannot always overcome challenges that a group can handle together." "But you risk your own success," Zix pointed out. "Do I?" Taman asked. "Or, do I demonstrate that humans understand something valuable about working with others?" The other representatives exchanged glances. They were beginning to understand that this human might be playing a much deeper game than anyone had realized. Late that night, as Taman prepared for sleep, Commander Thane visited his chamber. "Tomorrow is the final judgment," the dragon said. "It will test your strategic thinking and diplomatic skills under the greatest pressure you have yet faced." "I understand," Taman replied. "Do you?" Thane asked. "Supreme Arbiter Goran has ruled over these trials for 3 centuries. He has never seen behavior like yours. Some of the council believe you are either brilliant or completely mad." "What do you believe?" Taman asked. Thane's eyes reflected the chamber's dim lighting. "I believe you are the most dangerous representative we have ever faced, precisely because you do not think like we expected." After the dragon left, Taman lay on his hard bed and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would determine not just his fate, but the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. He had made it this far by being himself, rather than trying to be what others expected. Tomorrow he would find out if that was enough. The morning of the final judgment brought attention to the dragon ship that Taman could feel in the air itself. As he was escorted to the den, he noticed that the corridors were more crowded than before. Word of his unusual performance had spread, and dragons throughout the ship wanted to witness the conclusion of the trial. The den had been transformed overnight. Additional seating areas had been installed around the chamber's perimeter, and every space was filled with dragon observers. At the center, a complex holographic display system had been erected, capable of projecting 3-dimensional scenarios in perfect detail. Supreme Arbiter Goran looked even more imposing than before, his ancient scales gleaming under the enhanced lighting. The other members of the Dragon Council sat in a semicircle behind him, their expressions unreadable but their attention completely focused on Taman. "The final judgment begins now," Goran announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive chamber. "You will be presented with scenarios that test your strategic thinking, diplomatic skills, and decision-making under extreme pressure. You must negotiate not just for your species' survival, but for their place in the galactic community." The holographic display activated, showing a detailed map of the local sector of space. Taman recognized the hegemony's territory, marked in red, as well as the smaller regions controlled by other species. Humanity's space was a tiny blue dot at the edge of the map. "Scenario 1, Goran continued. "The hegemony faces rebellion on 3 conquered worlds simultaneously. Our military forces are stretched thin. How would humanity assist us in maintaining order?" It was a trap, Taman realized immediately. The expected answer would be to offer military support, essentially making humanity complicit in suppressing other species. But that would also demonstrate that humans were just another potential tool for dragon expansion. "Before I can answer," Taman said, "I need more information about these rebellions. What are the specific grievances of the rebelling populations?" A murmur went through the dragon audience. Most representatives simply accepted the scenarios as presented and tried to provide solutions. This human was questioning the premise. "The reasons are irrelevant," Commander Thane interjected. "Order must be maintained." "Are they?" Taman asked. "In human experience, rebellions usually have underlying causes. Treating symptoms without addressing root problems leads to recurring conflicts that drain resources and destabilize regions." He stepped closer to the holographic display and pointed to the rebelling worlds. "These 3 planets are all resource-rich, but located far from major hegemony strongholds. Long supply lines, minimal dragon presence, and valuable assets that local populations see being extracted without fair compensation." The details he provided were accurate, and several dragons exchanged surprised glances. How did this human know so much about their internal affairs? I propose a different approach, Taman continued. Instead of military suppression, negotiate new agreements that give local populations a stake in the resource extraction. Humans could serve as neutral mediators in these negotiations. Weakness, snarled one of the council members. You suggest rewarding rebellion. I suggest preventing future rebellions while maintaining resource flow, Taman replied calmly. Which approach actually strengthens the hegemony's long-term position? Supreme Arbiter Goran leaned forward slightly. Present your detailed proposal. For the next hour, Taman outlined a comprehensive plan for transforming the hegemony's relationship with its conquered territories. He proposed profit-sharing agreements, local autonomy in exchange for resource quotas, and human diplomatic teams to facilitate negotiations. Most importantly, he suggested using the same approach with other conquered worlds before rebellion started, turning potential enemies into invested partners. Scenario 2, Goran announced when Taman finished. A rival empire approaches the hegemony with an alliance proposal. They offer military cooperation in exchange for shared territory and resources. How should we respond? Again, Taman requested additional details. Which empire? What were their true capabilities? What were their long-term goals? His questions revealed a sophisticated understanding of interstellar politics that impressed even the Dragon observers. When he finally provided his answer, it was not the simple acceptance or rejection the Dragons expected. Instead, Taman proposed a multi-layered response that would gain information about the rival empire's true intentions, while keeping options open for future negotiations. Humans could serve as covert intelligence gatherers, he suggested. Our species is new enough to galactic politics that we would not be seen as threatening. We could establish trade relationships with this rival empire and report back on their real military capabilities and political stability. The third scenario was the most challenging. The Dragons presented a situation where the hegemony faced imminent invasion by a technologically superior enemy. How could humanity help in a desperate defensive war? Taman studied the holographic battle projections for several minutes before speaking. This enemy relies on overwhelming technological advantage and centralized command structures. Their weakness is that they cannot adapt quickly to unexpected tactics. He began sketching modifications to the Dragon fleet formations, suggesting ways to use humanity's smaller, more maneuverable ships to disrupt enemy communications and target their command vessels. Humans excel at asymmetric warfare, he explained. We do not try to match superior enemies directly. Instead, we find ways to negate their advantages while exploiting their weaknesses. But then Taman did something that stunned the entire assembly. He turned away from the military projections and addressed Supreme Arbiter Goran directly. However, I have a question for the Council, he said. Why are you fighting this war? The den fell silent. The question was so unexpected that several Dragons visibly started. Because we are being invaded, Commander Thane replied, as if the answer was obvious. But why are you being invaded? Taman pressed. What does this enemy want? Territory, resources, revenge for past conflicts? The answer determines whether military resistance is the best response. He gestured to the holographic display. If they want territory, perhaps negotiation could find them uninhabited systems to settle. If they want resources, maybe trade agreements could provide what they need without war. If they want revenge, understanding the original grievance might lead to different solutions. You suggest surrender, accused one of the council members. I suggest that the strongest position is often the one that provides multiple options, Taman replied. Military strength is important, but diplomatic flexibility can achieve victory without destruction. Supreme Arbiter Goran's ancient eyes fixed on Taman with laser intensity. You speak of options we have not considered. How do you know so much about warfare, diplomacy, and our internal politics? This was the moment Taman had been preparing for. He took a deep breath and decided to reveal his strategy. Because I have been studying you since I arrived, he said simply. Every challenge, every conversation, every meal has been an opportunity to learn about Dragon psychology, military doctrine, and political structure. He gestured to the conquered representatives who were watching from the sides of the den. I also spoke with representatives of your subject species. They provided insights into the problems the hegemony faces that your own reports might not reveal. The admission sent shockwaves through the dragon audience. This human had been gathering intelligence throughout the trial, turning what appeared to be kindness toward other representatives into strategic reconnaissance. You deceived us, Commander Thane said, but his tone held more admiration than anger. I was honest about my intentions, Taman corrected. I came here to represent humanity's interests. That required understanding what I was dealing with. Supreme Arbiter Goran rose from his throne, his massive form casting shadows across the chamber. You have turned our own trial into a learning experience. You studied us while we tested you. You built alliances while appearing to offer simple kindness. Yes, Taman admitted. And now you believe you understand the hegemony well enough to propose fundamental changes to how we operate? I believe I understand enough to know that the current system is unsustainable, Taman replied. The hegemony is powerful, but brittle. Too many enemies, too many rebellions, too many resources spent on suppression instead of development. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of dragons who had initially dismissed him as insignificant. Humanity offers something different, not submission or domination, but partnership. We can help you build something stronger than an empire based on fear. The silence that followed stretched for long minutes. Finally, Supreme Arbiter Goran spoke again. The final judgment is complete. The council will deliberate. You will have your answer tomorrow. As guards escorted him back to his chamber, Taman noticed that the conquered representatives were watching him with expressions he had never seen before. Hope mixed with something that looked like awe. He had not just survived the trial, he had challenged the fundamental assumptions it was based upon. Tomorrow would determine whether his gamble had succeeded or doomed humanity to isolation. Taman spent the night unable to sleep. Every few hours he could hear dragon voices in the corridors outside his chamber, some raised in heated discussion. The council's deliberations were clearly intense, and word of the unusual trial had spread throughout the hegemony fleet. When morning came, Commander Thane arrived with an expression Taman had not seen before. The dragon looked almost uncertain, as if the ground he had stood on for centuries had shifted beneath his feet. The council has reached a decision, Thane said. But first, Supreme Arbiter Goran wishes to speak with you privately. They walked through corridors that seemed different somehow. Dragons they passed stopped their conversations to stare at Taman, but their expressions were not the dismissive amusement of a few days ago. Now he saw curiosity, speculation, and in some cases, something that looked like respect. Goran waited, alone in a smaller chamber adjacent to the den. Without his throne and the formal setting, the ancient dragon somehow seemed even more imposing. His intelligence was visible in eyes that held centuries of experience. Sit, Goran commanded, gesturing to a chair that had been sized for humans. Taman sat and waited. He had learned that with dragons, patience often revealed more than questions. In 300 years of conducting these trials, Goran began, I have seen 43 species attempt to prove their worth. 37 failed completely and were marked as unworthy. 6 achieved partial success and were granted limited trading privileges. He paused, studying Taman's face. None have ever challenged the trial itself. None have ever turned the evaluation process into a mutual examination. None have ever made the council question whether our methods are the best way to identify potential allies. Did I overstep? Taman asked. Magnificently, Goran replied, and for the first time, Taman heard something like humor in the ancient dragon's voice. You have created a crisis of philosophy that has split the council into 3 factions. Goran moved to a window that looked out into space, where both the dragon fleet and the human diplomatic vessel could be seen. The traditionalists believe you are dangerously clever, and that humanity should be marked as unworthy before you can cause more disruption to our established order. They argue that species who question authority are inherently unreliable as partners. Taman's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. The progressives believe you have identified serious flaws in our approach and that humanity offers exactly the kind of fresh perspective the hegemony needs to evolve. They argue that stagnation is a greater threat than change. And the third faction? Taman asked. The pragmatists, Goran said with what might have been a dragon smile. They believe the question is not whether humanity is worthy of partnership, but whether the hegemony is worthy of humanity. The statement hit Taman like a physical blow. He had never considered that the trial might work both ways. You studied us, Goran continued, but we also studied you. Your performance revealed not just human capabilities but human values. Your willingness to help competitors, your focus on long-term solutions over short-term victories, your ability to maintain strategic thinking under extreme pressure. The ancient dragon turned back to face Taman directly. Most importantly, your consistent choice to build rather than destroy, to include rather than dominate. These are not typical behaviors among species powerful enough to survive in galactic politics. They are human behaviors, Taman said simply. Yes, Goran agreed. Which brings us to the council's decision. They returned to the den, which was packed with even more dragons than the day before. Taman noticed that several of the conquered representatives had been brought to witness the final proceedings. Kyle and Zix stood near the front, their expressions tense with anticipation. Supreme Arbiter Goran took his position on the great throne, but before he could speak, another dragon stepped forward. This one was younger than most of the council members, his scales bearing the bright coloration that indicated high rank. I am Battle Commander Vorthak, the dragon announced, champion of the hegemony and defender of our traditional ways. I challenge the council's preliminary decision. A stir went through the assembled crowd. Taman had no idea what this meant, but the reaction suggested it was significant. The human has been clever, Vorthak continued, but cleverness alone does not prove worthiness. I invoke the right of final challenge. Let him face me in combat to determine whether humanity truly deserves partnership with the hegemony. I accept, Taman said immediately before anyone could explain what he was agreeing to. Vorthak's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. You do not even know what you have accepted, small human. Does it matter? Taman replied. If this is what it takes to secure humanity's future, then this is what I will do. Supreme Arbiter Goran raised one massive claw for silence. The right of final challenge has been invoked and accepted. However, the human may propose modifications to the traditional format. Taman thought quickly. A physical combat against a dragon champion was suicide, but there might be other options. I propose that instead of fighting to determine who is stronger, we compete to determine who can better serve the hegemony's actual needs, he said. Vorthak snorted with derision. Explain. Give us both the same problem to solve, Taman continued. Something the hegemony actually faces. Let us each propose solutions, and let the council judge which approach would be more effective. You seek to avoid honorable combat, Vorthak accused. I seek to demonstrate what humans can actually offer, Taman replied. If you believe strength alone is the measure of worth, then you should easily defeat my approach. The challenge was accepted. The problem chosen was real and immediate. The hegemony controlled a sector where 3 different species were on the verge of open warfare over resource rights. Traditional dragon solutions had failed to prevent the escalating conflict. Vorthak presented first. His solution was classic hegemony doctrine: impose order through superior force, redistribute resources according to dragon preferences, and establish permanent military oversight to prevent future conflicts. Clear, decisive, and efficient, he concluded. The strong rule, the weak obey, and stability is maintained. When Taman's turn came, he had a different approach entirely. The conflict exists because each species believes they are losing resources they need for survival, he began. Military force can stop the fighting temporarily, but it does not address the underlying fear that drives the aggression. He outlined a plan that involved detailed resource surveys to identify currently unused deposits, technological sharing, to improve extraction efficiency, and rotating administrative control that gave each species a stake in the sector's prosperity. Most importantly, he concluded, we established joint exploration missions to identify new resource-rich systems that all three species can develop together. Instead of fighting over limited resources, we expand the total available wealth. The two approaches could not have been more different. Vorthak offered immediate control through strength. Taman offered long-term prosperity through cooperation. The council deliberated for 2 hours while the audience waited in tense silence. When they returned, Supreme Arbiter Goran's expression was unreadable. Battle Commander Vorthak's solution follows proven hegemony methods, Goran announced. It would end the immediate conflict quickly and decisively. Taman's heart sank. However, Goran continued, analysis suggests that it would also create the conditions for future, larger conflicts as the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Hope flickered back to life. The human solution is more complex and requires more initial investment, Goran said. But modeling indicates it would not only resolve the current crisis but strengthen the hegemony's position throughout the sector. The ancient dragon rose from his throne and stepped down to stand directly in front of Taman. More than that, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. The human solution demonstrates a fundamental understanding of something we have forgotten in our centuries of dominance. Goran paused, and when he spoke again, his words would be repeated throughout hegemony space for generations to come. True. Strength lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the ability to make others stronger while growing stronger. Ursel Goran turned to address the entire assembly. The human has demonstrated that cooperation can achieve what conquest cannot. He has shown us a path to growth instead of mere expansion. The ancient dragon then did something that had never happened in the 300-year history of the trials. He slowly lowered himself until one knee touched the floor of the den. In recognition of superior strategic thinking and a wisdom that our empire has lost, I acknowledge the worthiness of humanity. One by one, every member of the Dragon Council followed suit, even Battle Commander Vorthak, his expression showing shock and something like awe, knelt before the small human who had challenged everything they thought they knew about strength. The conquered representatives watched in amazement as the most powerful beings in the sector performed the ritual of respect that had never been given to any outside species. Rise, Taman of humanity, Goran commanded as he stood again. The trial of worth is complete. Humanity is not merely granted trading, rights, or limited partnership. You are offered full alliance status with the draconic hegemony. But Taman was not finished. The docking bay of the Unity's Pride felt strangely small after the massive chambers of the dragon ship. Taman stepped off the shuttle to find a crowd of diplomats and crew members waiting for him, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed anticipation. Ambassador Hyunwoo stood at the front of the group, his expression carefully neutral. Behind him, Minji wore a look that suggested she was already preparing explanations for Taman's expected failure. Welcome back, Hyunwoo said, his voice carrying across the bay. I trust your experience with the dragons was educational. Very much so, Taman replied simply. The crowd waited for him to elaborate, to provide details of his defeat and humiliation. When he remained silent, shifting uncomfortably began among the assembled diplomats. Well? Minji finally asked, unable to contain herself. What happened? Did they at least allow you to present humanity's position before rejecting it? They did more than that, Taman said. They accepted it completely. The words caused a stir through the crowd. Several people exchanged confused glances, as if they had misheard. I'm sorry, Hyunwoo said slowly. Could you repeat that? The draconic hegemony has granted humanity full alliance status, Taman announced clearly. Not trading rights or limited partnership. Full alliance. I have been appointed as the first human ambassador to the hegemony. The silence that followed was so complete that the background hum of the ship's systems seemed loud by comparison. Minji was the first to recover. That's impossible. No species has ever achieved alliance status with the dragons. You must be mistaken about what they offered. I'm not mistaken, Taman replied, pulling out a crystal data storage device that gleamed with dragon craftsmanship. The formal treaty is here, along with trade agreements, technology sharing protocols, and joint defense arrangements. Hyunwoo's face had gone pale. What did you do? I represented humanity honestly, Taman said. I showed them what we could offer as partners instead of subjects. As word spread through the ship, Taman found himself surrounded by people who had barely acknowledged his existence a week ago. Suddenly everyone wanted to know details of his strategy, his negotiations, his insights into dragon psychology. But Taman had other priorities. His first stop was the Communications Center, where he sent a detailed report to Earth's Diplomatic Council. His second stop was his old workstation, where he began analyzing the information the dragons had shared about other species in the region. It was there that Hyunwoo found him 3 hours later, working with the same quiet focus he had always shown. We need to talk, the ambassador said, his usual confidence notably absent. They went to Hyunwoo's office, where the older man closed the door and activated privacy shields before speaking. You realize what you've done, don't you? Hyunwoo asked. You've made me look like a fool. My entire career was built on the assumption that first contact with the dragons would be a carefully managed disaster. Your assumption was wrong, Taman replied without heat. Yes, it was, Hyunwoo admitted, surprising him. The question now is what happens next. Earth is going to want explanations. They're going to want to know why their most junior diplomat succeeded where seasoned ambassadors would have failed. Taman met the older man's gaze steadily. Are you asking me to lie in my report? I'm asking you to consider the bigger picture, Hyunwoo said. If you reveal that this assignment was intended as a sacrifice, it will destroy careers and damage the diplomatic corps. It should, Taman said flatly. People who use their colleagues as expendable pawns have no business representing humanity to alien civilizations. You're young, Hyunwoo said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. You don't understand how these things work. I understand perfectly, Taman replied. I also understand that the dragons are watching how we handle this situation. They'll judge humanity partly on whether we reward competence or protect incompetence. The next morning brought a priority transmission from Earth. The Diplomatic Council had received Taman's report and wanted immediate clarification. A full review board was being assembled to investigate how such an unprecedented success had been achieved. 3 days later, the review board arrived via high-speed courier ship. Taman was not surprised to see that it was led by Director Young-ho, one of the most respected figures in the diplomatic corps. What did surprise him was that the board included Admiral Soo-young from the military and Professor Ji-hee from the Xenology Institute. The hearings took place in the ship's main conference room, with full recordings for later analysis on Earth. Taman testified for 6 hours on the first day, providing detailed accounts of each phase of the trial. When he described his strategy of studying the dragons while they tested him, Director Young-ho leaned forward with interest. You treated the trial as a reconnaissance mission, the director observed. Partly, Taman agreed, but also as a chance to demonstrate human values. The dragons needed to see not just what we could do, but who we were. And who are we? Professor, Ji-hee asked. Taman considered the question carefully. We're a species that has learned cooperation through necessity. We've made every mistake it's possible to make, and we've survived by adapting and helping each other. On the second day, Hyunwoo and Minji gave their testimony. Under questioning, the truth about their intentions became clear. They had indeed sent Taman expecting him to fail, planning to use his failure as cover for their own negotiations. Did you inform Earth Command of this strategy? Admiral Soo-young asked. No, Hyunwoo admitted reluctantly. We felt it was better to maintain operational flexibility. You mean you felt it was better to have a scapegoat ready? The Admiral replied bluntly. The review board's final report was damning for the senior diplomatic staff but glowing for Taman. More importantly, it recommended sweeping changes to how humanity approached first contact situations. 2 weeks after the hearings concluded, Taman received new orders. He was promoted to senior ambassador and given command of humanity's first permanent diplomatic mission to the hegemony. His staff would include several of the junior diplomats who had been overlooked by the old system. Hyunwoo was reassigned to a desk job on Earth. Minji was removed from the diplomatic corps entirely. But the most interesting development came from the dragons themselves. A message from Supreme Arbiter Goran announced that the first of the former conquered species had successfully completed their modified trials. Kale's people had been granted full alliance status, followed shortly by Zix's species. The concept of cooperative evaluation is spreading throughout our territory, Goran's message continued. Several species that had been planning rebellions are now requesting opportunities to undergo the new trials. The message concluded with an invitation for Taemin to return to hegemony space as soon as possible. There was work to be done reshaping galactic politics. As the Unity's pride prepared to depart for the hegemony's capital world, Taemin stood in the observation deck looking out at the stars. Captain Donghyun, the shuttle pilot who had given him advice before the trial, joined him at the viewport. Feeling satisfied with how things turned out? The older man asked. Satisfied? Taemin considered the question. I think I'm feeling something, more like responsible. Success is just the beginning. Now we have to prove we deserve it. The dragons seem to think you already have, Donghyun observed. The dragons learned something from watching humans, Taemin replied. But humans are learning something too. We're discovering that our greatest strength isn't our technology or our military capability. What is it then? Taemin smiled as he watched the stars wheel slowly past. Our ability to see potential partners where others see only enemies or subjects. Our willingness to lift others up instead of standing on them. He turned from the viewport, ready to return to his quarters and continue preparing for the challenges ahead. The galaxy is full of species that have mastered domination, he said as they walked. It's time someone showed them what cooperation can accomplish. 3 months later, the first Galactic Cooperation Summit convened in hegemony space. Representatives from 47 species attended, including several that had been enemies for centuries. The summit was chaired jointly by Supreme Arbiter Goran and Ambassador Taemin. By the end of the meetings, 12 new alliance agreements had been signed, and preliminary discussions had begun for a new form of interstellar organization based on mutual benefit rather than conquest. In his final report to Earth, Taemin wrote, "Humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization may not be our technology or our military strength, but our memory of what it means to grow stronger, together rather than by standing alone." The transformation was far from complete, and there would be setbacks and challenges ahead. But for the first time in galactic history, cooperation was becoming more powerful than conquest, and it had all started with a joke that became a revelation. When humanity's most expendable representative showed the galaxy a different definition of strength.